If you've been injured in a car accident, make sure you speak to our good friend Adam Burbrower at the Burbrower Law Firm. Adam and his crew do things the right way and get great results. Adam is not only the man of the hour, the man with the legal power, too sweet to be sour, he is also the excellence of elocution. Check out Adam at burbrowerlaw.com. Follow him on Facebook, and do not forget to tell him that Dan and Benny sent you.
Dan and Benny in the Ring is a podcast that everybody ought to listen to. As a matter of fact, I'm going to have Hotchkiss Featherbottom put it on my playlist because I don't know how to work that shit. But guys, in all seriousness, keep doing what you're doing. Keep plugging away. You can do it.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Dan and Benny in the Ring. I'm Dan Sebastiano, joined as always by the player himself, Benny Scala. Benny, how you doing, buddy?
Well, Dan, although this is the 230th episode of Dan and Benny in the Ring, it's the very first episode on Want Radio. WANT Radio is the station that hosts my Sunday Benny the Jet and the Jet Set Oldies show, and they're a great bunch of folks. So for those listening on Want Radio, welcome to Dan and Benny in the Ring. And Dan, just for your information, in 2 more episodes, we will tie CSI Miami at 232 episodes, just so you know.
Oh, man. You know, it's crazy. I said it before when we started all those years ago. At the time, according to the statistics from Apple and Google Podcasts, the average sports and entertainment podcast ran for 3 episodes. So we have long since shattered that, and here we are, keep chugging along. And we've got a hell of a topic tonight, Benny. We're going back to the classics, talking about the life and legacy of a true legend in the business. Benny, why don't you tell everybody who's joining us this evening?
Yeah, you know, Dan, when we set up our Facebook page, you wrote something very profound. You wrote, Dan and Benny look forward to wrestling's future while celebrating its storied past. Well, tonight, we're going to do a little bit of the latter. So here with us are Richard Vicek and Stephen Verrier. Are you guys the Killer V's? Authors of the great book, Wilbur Snyder, the world's most scientific wrestler. Gentlemen, welcome to Dan and Benny in the Ring.
Thanks very much.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, we appreciate having you. And this is, like I said, you know, the tagline from day one was always about celebrating the storied past. And through our involvements, I mean, our early success with the George Pontus episode, talking about Mid-Atlantic, obviously our dealings, excuse me, we've had all kinds of legends on the ring, from Jimmy Valiant on the show in the ring with us, as we say, Jimmy Valiant, you know, Ivan Putski, obviously, Benny, of course, you know, we still joke fondly our 100th episode with Ken Patera and his F-bomb record, our special where we, you know, 150th episode and of course, 200th episode, Tito Santana. And, you know, we just had all kinds of wondrous guests through the years. And that's part of it, is celebrating the past, because it's what we love to talk about and we want to get going with it. So I'm going to jump right into this. You know, because we'll get into the book. Of course, we'll get into the book. But I want you guys, this is a question for both of you, since we always start with a similar question for everybody. When did you become fans of wrestling?
Well, Richard will start. In early 1966, I was 9 years old. And there was television wrestling in Chicago. I didn't know at the time, but the matches were videotaped or filmed, depending on what season, were Minneapolis or Indianapolis. Minneapolis was the AWA, Vern Gagne's company. WWA was Wilbur Snyder and Dick the Bruiser's company. So I started watching that, and I was just floored by growly voice Dick the Bruiser and clean cut Wilbur Snyder and scientific Vern Gagne and a young loudmouth manager, pretty boy Bobby Heenan. You see behind me a wrestling poster. That's the poster from the second match I ever attended, May 21st, 1966, where Bruiser faced off against Mad Dog Vachon. Wilbur was on the card teaming with Moose Cholak, And after seeing a couple of those shows in 1966, I was hooked. And so now that's getting close to 60 years later.
Wow.
Nice.
Yeah, in my case, from my earliest days, it seems I was always a sports fan. I gravitated to baseball and hockey and football and a lot of other sports. But it was, I think sometime in the late 60s, the early late 60s perhaps, that I just happened across a wrestling show. And what caught my attention was the Sheik. And from what I recall, he busted a chair over the head of the TV announcer, the former wrestler Lord Athol Leighton. I think this was a match from, it could have been from Detroit or Toronto. We lived in the middle. But that attracted me. And I thought, wow, this sport is pretty exciting. It's different. I mean, you don't see guys breaking bats over the head of other players in baseball, but it was, well, at first it was the sheer violence, or the well, we could say the simulation, but the violence that drew me in. And during my early years as a fan, we got wrestling from places like Calgary, Detroit. Also, the Indianapolis wrestling was televised in Detroit. I was growing up in Southern Ontario, so I enjoyed watching these, the brawl type matches, the Dick the Bruisers, the Sheiks, Johnny Valentine, Pampero Firpo, King Curtis from Calgary at that time. That's really what drew me in. I mean, over time, I wouldn't say I'm particularly refined now, but I take a broader look at wrestling. But at first, it was that violence that attracted me, and I loved that. I mean, I still like a lot of other sports. Wrestling is in that mix, but I think it's the Sheik's fault that I'm here today.
Hard habit to break. So, Richard, I believe it was May of 2023 you were with us.
Yes.
You were talking about the Chicago Wrestling Club, and then your book, Bruiser, the world's most dangerous wrestler. And I started following in 1968. I started buying the magazines, and I always tell the story that, when I first opened a magazine, I thought, I grew up on Long Island, New York. I thought the entire wrestling universe was what I saw on TV. And, now I'm seeing these guys like Johnny Weaver and, Pat O'Connor and Lou Thez. And now, to me, the big three in the Midwest were Dick the Bruiser, Vern, and this other guy, Wilbur Snyder. And to me, Wilbur Snyder was always he reminded me of George Harrison. George Harrison was always the quiet Beatle. Didn't always get the fanfare. And it seems like Wilbur was kind of the same thing out of the three of them, very low key, but very, very, a great wrestler. So, if you could both maybe tell me, give me a quick bio about him. I know that he played for the Edmonton Eskimos, I believe. And I believe he was a tackle and a place kicker. But how did he transition from football into wrestling?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, it wasn't, the timeline is interesting. I mean, he went to university at Utah for a couple of years, and then he drove a cement truck for a couple of years because he was married. He had a son. He left college early. He was a very good football player in college, but he couldn't be considered for the NFL until his class graduated. So he had a couple of years to work. It was actually during that time, before he got back into football, first briefly with the Rams, at least in their preseason in '52, and then with the Eskimos. I mean, it was before all of that he started training to be a wrestler. He met a number of wrestlers while he was driving a cement truck for a couple of years in the early '50s. And he still did not have a professional match yet, but he was learning. He tried out for the Rams, barely missed the team. Immediately afterward, went to Edmonton. And it was right after the end of his first season with the Eskimos that he went back to Southern California, started wrestling professionally, and in fact, in a very few short months, had a title match against Luthez. I mean, there was just a meteoric start to his career. So it wasn't a matter of, concentrating solely on football, finishing that, getting into wrestling. I think he was open to either possibility before he did start his professional football stint in Calgary. It just so happened he sort of straddled those two sports for a couple of years, and then obviously wrestling paid a lot better. The weather was a lot better in Southern California than in Edmonton. And so he started concentrating full-time on wrestling. And also, I want to add that early in his career, people knew him. He was a national star. He was a phenomenon, largely on the heels of a very good performance against Luthez very early in his career that was nationally televised. So he was one of the highest profile wrestlers in the United States early on in his career. But, the Wilbur that a lot of people remember is the middle-aged Wilbur after he settled in Indianapolis. But perhaps Richard has a bit to add.
I just want to add that Sando Szabo and Warren Bockwinkel were said to be the most influential wrestlers on the young Wilbur Snyder. He had time that national television, first on the matches that originated from the Hollywood Legion Stadium, which is still in the Los Angeles area. It's a health club now, but that was nationally televised. And by 1956, he was part of the wrestling on the Dumont Network out of Chicago, Fred Kohler's promotion. Fred Kohler's promotion also included nationally syndicated filmed wrestling bouts from the International Amphitheater under the direction of the play-by-play announcer, Russ Davis. You could see a lot of these matches on YouTube under the auspices of the Chicago Film Archives. So you could see a lot of matches. One of the most amazing matches, Wilbur's, this is 1956, on one team, Antonino Rocca, Vern Gagne, and Wilbur Snyder against Reggie Lisowski, who later became the Crusher, Stan Halleck, who wrestled as Lisowski's brother, and Dick the Bruiser. That 32-minute match is on YouTube. You can still see it today. Stan Lisowski was the ring brother of the Crusher. Of course, he wasn't called the Crusher then. But that's the kind of exposure he had that I think made him noticeable for wrestling promoters in countless territories. I think he lived in 9 or 10 cities, moving around the country, United States and Canada, with his family.
Wow.
Learning the trade in those first 9 to 10 years.
Nice. Benny and I often comment on the show about the excessive use of false finishes in the current product. I mean, back in the day, no one was getting out of the sleeper, the Boston Crab, the abdominal stretch, the bear hug, none of these moves. The reason I bring that up is because the abdominal stretch was for a long time just such a deadly hold. And it's been said that Wilbur Snyder invented or created the abdominal stretch. Is this true?
Yeah, to a very large degree. I mean, going back to the days of Frank Gotch, of course, wrestlers did, apply moves designed to stretch or, somewhat similar holds. But Wilbur is the one who really, put it together in the form in which we recognize the abdominal stretch. And, it occurred to me, I mean, Wilbur did not have an extensive background as an amateur wrestler. He took it up while attending the University of Utah. He wrestled for a couple of years. He was good, but he was not an elite heavyweight wrestler at that time. And I don't know to what degree he was even aware of professional wrestling when he was younger. But I kind of suspect, I mean, when he was driving that cement truck and talking to people, especially like Sandor Szabo, but some of the other veterans, I wouldn't be surprised if they, filled Wilbur in on some of the old time wrestlers, some of the old time moves, and maybe based on some of their insights, Wilbur put things together and sort of perfected this abdominal stretch. I mean, other people have used it since, George Becker for certain, and I'm thinking Inoki later, who sort of added to it by putting the leg up over the guy and doing that octopus-like move. But Wilbur is the one. I mean, people say he popularized it, but I think he can really be credited as the one who made that move what it was and what sticks in people's minds to this day.
Okay. Now, I don't know how much of today's product you guys watch, but you see very frequent, heel to babyface to heel changes. Sometimes they don't make very much sense. And, back then, those changes were very rare. And when they did happen, they were very impactful. But, I was trying to think of who was a career babyface that never turned. And, I could think of Bruno. I thought of Tito Santana. I thought of Ricky Steamboat. And really a pretty short list. But then I'm thinking, how about Wilbur Snyder? Because to me, he was the All-American boy before Bob Backlund was the All-American boy. Did he ever turn heel?
Okay, I guess I will take that one. It is very interesting. Early in his career, I mean, Wilbur traveled the country, and, he was not a touring world champion, but he was somebody known from television, and he was somebody who was a big attraction would be put up against some of the top local guys where he traveled, much as an NWA world champion would do. So I know, for example, when he faced Gagne at times, Wilbur would be the rougher of the two, and often, would, I think, have it in his mind to get the people stirred up, and he did at times. So, he played the rough character at times. But when I talked to Mike Snyder, Wilbur's son, as Richard and I worked on the book, Mike told us about how his father loved going to Japan because it gave him a platform from which to play the heel.
Wow.
So again, video of those matches doesn't seem to exist, but apparently in Japan, Wilbur sometimes was put into the position of playing the bad guy, the somewhat nasty American. And Mike said his father just loved to do that because he didn't get a lot of opportunities. I mean, Backlund did late in his career. Wilbur never went that route, turning heel to any degree. But apparently he enjoyed being one in Japan, at least to a certain degree. I don't think he did anything particularly devious, but he probably did try to do things behind the referee's back, perhaps, or not break cleanly. So in his way, I think we could say he did actually.
Okay.
Japan, Wilbur was teamed with Danny Hodge for many trips. And of course, one of the most common opponents were Baba and Inoki, who were gods in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
So I just want to put, that's where there's a lot of historical events listed with those combatants.
No, I get that because I've seen a couple of, Bruno Sammartino has been my hero since, I first started watching. And I've seen a couple of clips when he was wrestling Baba in Japan. And he kind of was not really behaving a little bit. He was more aggressive than he would be in the States, and the fans weren't really reacting to him because Baba was their hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very similar situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, a minute ago I mentioned when we were talking about the false finishes in the current product. I was curious because you had mentioned something about kind of expanding on it. Is there any other moves that we wouldn't think about that you could either attribute to Wilbur Snyder or say that he popularized?
Well, I think he followed up on Leo Nomalini's football type moves, the blocking and that sort of thing. I mean, Wilbur at times used the airplane spin, but Londas had, made much of that previously. I don't know how much invention was involved, but he certainly was one of the pioneers of that baby-faced, clean-cut, all-American type fellow. And to this day, people who knew Snyder during his career, make comparisons with modern-day wrestlers. So, yeah, in a sense, I think we can consider Wilbur a bit of a prototype in that regard.
Okay. Well, I bounce back to the past because you were talking about his Benny had mentioned his face heel runs in his territory time. So it's 1964. Wilbur and the Bruiser buy NWA Indianapolis from Jim Barnett, and they create the World Wrestling Association. That is while a prominent moment, tends to kind of get lost in the shuffle of everything that was happening and who was coming and going at the time. Could you guys expand a bit on the history, the WWA? I mean, it had a really good run in the 70s through the early 80s at that point.
In late 1963, Snyder and Bruiser were the tag team champions for the Indianapolis wrestling promotion controlled by Jim Barnett and Buck Estes. Very shortly, though, after that, they were stripped of the titles by the State Athletic Commission because Bruiser's wife filed an application to be a wrestling promoter. And that set the stage for the creation of Championship Wrestling. The president was Louise Afflis. The vice president was Shirley Snyder.
Interesting.
The secretary treasurer was Margaret Afflis Johnston, Bruiser's mother. So they set out to build a better mousetrap, which they did in Indianapolis, running opposition to Barnett and Estes. And in my research for the Bruiser book, I tracked down Texas attorney William Estes, who said there never was one nickel paid by Bruiser and Snyder to Barnett, unlike in Detroit where Barnett got paid for the Sheik. Bruiser and Snyder established their own promotion, continued to wrestle in other cities to supplement their income while that promotion gained traction. Some of the highlights of those 1960s included the creation of Black Jack Lanza from being Cowboy Jack Lanza. Bruiser and Snyder's promotion had the tag team of Mitsu Arakawa and Dr. Moto, who simultaneously were the WWA champions in Indianapolis and the AWA tag team champions from Minnesota. So that, and of course, the biggest development in 1960s was the hiring of a stagehand at the Indianapolis Coliseum named Raymond Lewis Heenan.
Ooh.
And Bruiser said, "You're going to be Bobby, and I'm going to match you up with my assassins." So that promotion continued growing little by little every year till they had the best years ever in 1971 to 74 when they had the Blackjacks team. They had Cowboy Bob Ellis. They had Baron von Raschke, then the Valiant Brothers, Ernie Ladd, Ox Baker. So by those years, that was a prominent promotion, and they were under that promotion, the teams of the Blackjacks and the Valiants were put together. Of course, with every promotion, you lose traction. I don't know if we want to go into the downfall now, but they got there and they lost their promotion. It fizzled out just like Crockett, Watts, Geigel, Eddie Graham, you name it. They couldn't meet the challenge of cable TV coming from Atlanta, Georgia, or Secaucus, New Jersey. The WWF, and importantly too, the WWF started doing cards on USA Cable Network. I mean, how can Bruiser and Snyder compete at a 1,500 seat National Guard armory with 1981 Sergeant Slaughter and Pat Patterson in the alley fight nationwide on USA Cable Network? So anyway, that's just a little. It was very good for excellent for several years, and I'm sure every old territory that you folks study or have guests on, the ending's still the same.
But it was, now correct me, I think if my memory serves me correctly, when I bought the magazines in the late 60s and early 70s, they recognized when they did the rankings, it was recognized as a world championship. You had WWF, NWA, AWA, and then the magazines I bought, a lot of them had WWA.
Yes, especially the predecessor to Indianapolis, which was LA.
Yeah,
with
right.
Lassie and Carpentier and the Destroyer. But yes, and Wilbur, of course, and Bruiser always had powerful singles ratings throughout the 1960s. When those various magazines, would come up with ratings in the monthly issues, they surely stood out on a nationwide basis.
Yeah, I do remember that. One of the things I enjoy the most about these, when I do these interviews, is when I do the research and what I learned while doing the research. And I was amazed to see how many titles Wilbur had won. I guess going back to January 54, I guess he wasn't really too long in the business. He defeated Mr. Moto to win and I think this was out in Hollywood, beat the Champ International Television title. And then a week later, he wins the NWA International Television Tag Team titles. And, there's a gentleman named Gunther. Again, I don't know how much you watch the current product, but one of his storylines, he always says that, I've been a champion 80% of my time in the company. And, looking at Wilbur's history, I would say that he was like the first Gunther. It seemed like he always had a title of one, one sort of or another. Is that pretty accurate?
Early in his career, absolutely. I mean, as you say, he started out in Southern California. He wasn't in the business long before he started wrestling main events. And after that, not long until he started winning titles. I mean, for a solid decade, from the start of his career in 53 until he settled in Indianapolis to run a promotion, he was one of the most titled and most successful wrestlers in the United States, without a doubt. I mean, he's a guy who would be discussed when it came time to decide who was going to be the next NWA heavyweight champion. He was in demand pretty much everywhere. He didn't like the travel particularly because either he had to drag his family along or separate himself from that family. But yeah, he held many titles, throughout the Midwest. I mean, when he was the United States champion out of Chicago, the NWA, in a sense, saw him as a threat, a popularity threat to Lou Thez, the NWA heavyweight champion. Wilbur was recognized in many places as a traveling champion. He couldn't call himself the NWA world champion, and I'm not aware that he ever tried that. But he was recognized as, that great champion from the Midwest, from Chicago by that time, who, would hit different territories. And sometimes Denver especially comes to mind. Denver had an interesting situation in that there would be mention of Snyder as the United States champion, but the programs in Denver would be separate from those programs in Chicago, so you never knew exactly what was going on with that title. But during that first career, that first decade of his career, you could certainly say Wilbur was kind of like a Gunther. I mean, on the outside, not very much, but when you look at the substance and the success, that's a good comparison, I think.
Okay.
And I just want to add, all of those matches against Gagne and Bruiser during the 1950s, they had to cooperate together and put on a good show. Let's face it. Is it any surprise that in the 1964-65, they all put their heads together and become promoters, especially in Chicago under the auspices of the Chicago Wrestling Club? I had that theory, and that certainly set the stage for them realizing, hey, if I'm the executive producer, I may take a financial risk, but I could put myself in the main events and get the highest payoffs. And I happen to be, too, we happen to be some of the most talented wrestlers in the United States. And also, if we do a good job developing talent and promoting our shows, we share in the net profit of the operation. And that's the way to go in the wrestling business in the golden era.
You mentioned, excuse me, obviously Benny mentioned that Wilbur had won many singles titles, and you mentioned his run against Gagne. One of the titles of note that came up was the Omaha version of the World Heavyweight title, which he did win from Gagne. So I kind of want to question, maybe not that title specifically, but during this run, who were his greatest rivals? Per when credit where it's due, ProWrestlingData.com, there's 197 listed matches against Angelo Poffo and 183 against the Bruiser, with winning records, by the way, against both of them. So during this run, who would have been his big rivals? Who would have been the marquee money matches he was having?
Well, during that run, definitely Gagne and Bruiser would be on that list. Poffo, of course, a very underrated wrestler himself. And I think you would have to add Hans Schmidt to that mix as well. I mean, he had significant title history in the Midwest. He was, nowadays when people think of the German wrestler attractions of that era, I mean, whether they came from Quebec or Texas or wherever, the names that come to mind are, Fritz von Erich, I think, more than Hans Schmidt. Even Raschke, because he is more recent, but Hans Schmidt was another national wrestling star and a major rival of Wilbur Snyder's. But if we're looking at all of Snyder's significant opponents during that first decade of his career, although there were not nearly as many matches with this particular wrestler, I would put Lou Thesz at the very top, because he is the man who played such a huge role in launching Snyder's career. I mean, you cannot overestimate or overstate, I think, Lou Thesz's contribution to what Wilbur Snyder would become. So I would definitely put him right there with Gagne and Bruiser and Schmidt and also Fritz von Erich and others as very key opponents in the career of Wilbur Snyder.
Okay. In preparation for this show, I found a match on YouTube. I think it was from the late 50s from the Chicago Amphitheater. It was Wilbur against Verne. And actually, it seemed to me that Verne was a little bit more of the ruffian in the match, and the crowd was a little bit more behind Wilbur. But, I mean, 32 minutes, an absolute masterpiece. The way these guys, traded arm bars and, drop toe holds and leg locks. I mean, just, the sad thing, and what I thought to myself is, if this match was held today on Monday Night Raw, how long before somebody started saying boring? At 30 seconds into the first top wrist lock. But, I mean, you didn't hear anybody saying that. I mean, you could tell by the way the crowd reacted. They were totally into this match from, like, the start to the finish. And it ended when I believe they were bouncing off the ropes. And Wilbur, I believe, tried to scoop Verne up for a body slam. He was too close to the ropes. And then they both tumbled out and they both got counted out. 32 minutes. And I enjoyed every second of it. So I was wondering, again, I don't know how much you watch of the current product, but maybe if you could make your own comments on the evolution of wrestling from what I saw, on YouTube today to what we see on Monday night and how different it is.
Yeah. Who starts?
I want to say that people now want more sizzle. They want fireworks. They want chair shots. That has evolved over many decades. That style of wrestling was still in place when I started and went to the amphitheater to see Snyder and Gagne. It was a little different atmosphere when Bruiser was in the ring. With the We Want Blood, that whole new chapter was open, but Gagne and Snyder still stuck to old school scientific wrestling, and it worked even into the 70s.
Yeah, and obviously in the last several decades, American professional wrestling is catered more toward a younger audience looking for entertainment of a more soap opera variety, I guess. So, there does seem to be more interest now from WWE in hiring some legitimate athletes, or at least giving them a chance. But, in Snyder's and Gagne's day, that real athletic background meant something to promoters, to fans, and even to some sports writers with the major newspapers, those who seem to care about the product anyway. But it's interesting. I would say that, I do spend regular periods in Japan, and I will be there again very shortly. And if you ever have a chance, perhaps you have had a chance, but if you ever go to Korakuen Hall in Tokyo, just about every wrestling company in Japan, regardless of its size, will appear at some point at Korakuen Hall. And at that venue, Wilbur and Verne from the 1950s would work to this day. I mean, you've got some devoted fans, people who know something of the history, people who are happy to sit through an hour-long match, and assuming it's well done. So that kind of an audience still survives, but yeah, we're not going to see many of those people watching on Monday nights, or in fact living anywhere in the United States, unfortunately. But thank goodness for YouTube, and hopefully more of this old footage turns up. I mean, yeah, it's great stuff.
Oh yeah.
Gotta love it. Something, Benny was talking research earlier. Something else that came up in the course of the research, and I know you mentioned it in the stories. Wilbur's daughter married Steve Regal, not, for those listening, not Lord Stephen Regal, who better known as William Regal later on, but Steve Regal, Mr. Electricity of the AWA fame. Did Wilbur bring Steve into the business, or was that just a wrestler that was already there, that kind of the family business, as they say?
Yes. They were married at around age 20, around 1971. They're still married, living in an Indianapolis suburb. But both
Wow.
Steve and Cindy attended Pike High School in Indianapolis, where Mike Snyder also had years for his high school. Steve was a carpenter by trade and was asked by Wilbur and Dick, hey, do you think you could build a wrestling ring for us? Because that was the days where sometimes they would do 2 spot shows in a day. They were starting to get really more popular. Well, Steve built the ring. They liked it. Then an opening came about to someone to drive the ring truck. Steve did that. He sold programs. He was then a referee. And then finally he said, Wilbur, I think I could do this as a wrestler. He was in good physical shape, and he says the hardest trainer on him was Wilbur. He had a lot of other variety of people. He mentioned Rene Goulet. They worked in some hot barn in Indianapolis, taking backflips, Irish whips, and he debuted as a wrestler. A lot of times in the WWA, he was teamed with Bruiser's son-in-law, Spike Huber.
Huber, yeah.
And unfortunately for the WWA, Steve Regal progressed too much for his own good. If he wanted to stay, he couldn't just stay in Indianapolis, making $70 a night or that whole thing, especially at the time when the WWA was starting to fizzle. And he went on to all these different territories. And his, I guess, biggest achievement was sharing the AWA World Tag Team Championship with Jimmy Garvin and taking those belts from the Road Warriors. How's that for a notch?
Quite the upset there, yeah.
Very much.
But well deserved. And he, like he said, he's retired now in suburban Indianapolis with Cindy.
Okay. So how did Wilbur and Bruiser get along as partners? It seemed like Bruiser was always putting himself on top as the WWA champion, but I think Wilbur had about 15 tag team championship runs. Did they have a good working relationship?
I'll start out. They had some differentiation of duties. Bruiser was the main guy behind talent relations, coaching wrestlers during the live shows and TV tapings. Bruiser was the TV planner and supervised the editing of tapes, that were bicycled out to the various towns, which included Chicago, Elkhart, Indiana, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Terre Haute, Indiana. There were, now Wilbur, on the other hand, he was the bookkeeper. He counted the beans, as they said. And by the early 70s, there were a lot of beans to count. And of course, both guys, worked together on major decisions. Who was brought in, who was going to get a push. Yes, Bruiser tended to dominate the singles championship, but Wilbur held, 13, 14 tag team championships during that run. So, all the research I did, I'm only aware of one issue that anyone ever said to me. Hey, Bruiser and Snyder, they had a big issue with this, and it had to do with the firing or replacing of their general manager and TV announcer, Sam Menaker, in the early 1980s, where there was a difference of opinion. That, that's the only thing that all these people, I interviewed 250 people for the Bruiser book. The only conflict that anyone ever told me about was over the Menaker firing. And of course, that resulted in the hiring of David McLean, who went on for decades in various various Glow wrestling women promotions. So that whole event had a silver lining where McLean is still doing the women's wrestling in various venues on various channels. So that was they had a very amicable relationship. I think Bruiser was a little more on the rough side, and Wilbur was more cerebral. I guess that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, and people I talked to certainly indicated that Bruiser and Snyder got along well. And, I suspect that a good part of that is due to the fact that Wilbur really did not seem to have a big ego. He wanted to do what was best for the promotion. And, by that stage, he was, by 69, he was 40 years old. So, he was not the all-American boy that he had been earlier. And, probably he thought, well, as a singles wrestler, it's very possible he thought, yeah, Bruiser wants to do it. He is the face of the promotion in that regard. But I would say Wilbur was not an egotistical fellow. He would drop a match. He would do what was good for the promotion, and that makes him stand out from a lot of wrestlers. In fact, I was one time I asked myself, which wrestlers would I trust for any time with my children? I came up with a few names. Don Leo Jonathan, whom I got to know a little bit, definitely is one of those people. I would have trusted Don Leo with my kids. Bruno Sammartino, I think, as well. And Wilbur Snyder strikes me as a person of that caliber. So, again, he was not ego-driven. He wanted to do a good job, but he wanted to do a good job for the company and especially for his family, to provide for them and, keep them in one place. Pretty impressive fellow in any case.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. For those that can see the thumbnail, I used a picture from one of his profiles, and there's a lot of good photos out there. But for a man who was as in shape as Wilbur was, that could run circles around people half his age, he just absolutely a fit, well taken care of man, at least on the outside is what it appeared. He died at a very young age at 62 in an era when wrestlers dying young was not as common as it is today. Is there a story, a health issue there that's not as publicly well known?
Wilbur retired in his early 50s from the promotion. He worked, he shared homes with his wife in Indianapolis and Pompano Beach, Florida. In December of 1991, he was walking on the beach along the Atlantic Ocean, and all of a sudden he couldn't walk and he lost some strength in his body. A neighbor got him home. They brought him to the hospital in Pompano Beach, and he was diagnosed with lymphatic leukemia
Oh,
Wow.
at age. And Mike Snyder says the family was just devastated because just 2 months before, Wilbur had a clean bill of health. And all of a sudden, this blood cancer condition comes on. Well, Wilbur's in the hospital on Christmas Day, 1991, and he suffers a fatal heart attack with his son and daughter in the room. And doctors couldn't revive.
oh,
It was a quick end for somebody who, in the obituary in the Indianapolis Star, the final week, Wilbur's still playing tennis, which is his post-wrestling passion. So who knows? But yes, that was the sad, quick ending of Wilbur Everhard Snyder.
Kind of ironic because I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that he and Bruiser, we've been talking about both of them all hour. They were born within, a few months of each other, and they both died at 62. They both died in 1991, I believe, within a few months of each other. And I believe they both died in Florida. I believe Wilbur died in Pompano Beach, and then Bruiser died in Tampa, I believe.
Yes. So, yeah.
Eerie coincidence.
Bruiser, it was reportedly while lifting weights, just ruptured a blood vessel in his esophagus.
Yikes.
Doing some kind of weightlifting because he was scheduled to go back to Japan with a tour with the Crusher, according to Larry Lisowski, the son of the Crusher.
Okay, so
that was the sad ending. Wilbur had a record both as a wrestler and a promoter to be proud of. And he had a family legacy whereby his daughter and son all were married, or still married after 50 years. There were 4 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren, which 6 of them that Wilbur never even got to meet because he passed away. So
wow. Wow. Yeah, well, what a great career. But so where do we find this book? And are you guys working on any other projects? And how do we find you on social media?
Well, the book can be found at crowbarpress.com. And I can be found on Facebook. Just put Stephen Verrier, Verrier, in the search box. And I'm the one with the white beard who lives near Seattle. Also, I can be found at stephenverrier.com.
And I'm on Facebook from the Chicago area. And yes, we are doing research to see what's a suitable next project. But but we want to make sure that the research and the facts and the material is there. Because want to make we don't want to say we want to get our ducks in a row before we say, oh yeah, our next project is going to be on battling Benny Geralds or whoever it could be. So that's it. We're doing more research on this, and find out, do we have enough material to convince people to look into the next project.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with that said, I want to add that it will be the best book ever.
Of course, absolutely.
Man, I got excited for a second there when he said his next book was going to be on a Benny. I thought
Yeah,
maybe they finally get to play a biography out there.
Well, I collect some royalties there,
Right. I mean, you got to get the book written first so that, Brad Pitt can play you in the movie when it comes
That's
out
right.
in a few years.
I was thinking more like Bobcat Goldthwait, maybe.
or whoever they want. I don't know. And they'll hopefully whoever they get to play my supporting character will be worth it.
Sure.
I'll even take some kind of a identity swap if you bring in somebody like Denzel Washington or whatever.
Sure, why not? That sounds fun.
But gentlemen, Stephen, Richard, we thank you guys so much for your time. Of course, Benny and I, we love talking the past. Like he said, the tagline of the show has for years been, the second part of it is celebrating wrestling storied past. As we wrap up tonight, final thoughts to you guys. Anything you want to share on your as we wrap up?
Thank you for having us on. We appreciate your interest in wrestling's past. It's quite a history, so I appreciate it. Thank you guys, and thank you, Steve, for being good to work with.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and as Richard said, we appreciate the chance to speak to you guys. And again, to anybody listening who knows only the middle-aged Wilbur Snyder, the one that I grew up watching, check out his matches in the 1950s. I mean, he was an attraction like very few others in the United States for a solid decade. And for those who come back and say that, well, he had such a short career on top. Well, I would tell those people, take a look at his first decade in promotion, or even his first 15 years in promotion. And you've got a legacy there that very few other people involved in the wrestling industry during that era can even come close to. Snyder, there are others, but Snyder is one who definitely needs to be remembered and acknowledged.
Respect that.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you, guys.
Oh, I'm sorry, Richard.
Right.
I thought you had something else. No, I can't stress enough, Stephen. Those are brilliant parting words. To go watch this. Part of the reason Benny and I love doing what we do, and I know it's sad to say, is the talent from that generation is largely gone, and fans from that generation are, they're at the point now where it's like it's their kids and their grandkids. Like, this is what I grew up watching. This was wrestling years ago. You wonder how time flies. I mean, in the grand scheme of wrestling, WrestleMania is a relatively new feature in modern, I air quotes, modern wrestling, and they've had over 40 of them. And it's like when you talk about the 1950s and era that was, but even before my time, I grew up on all the old tapes. As a kid, I used to love watching all the black and white tapes that would get circulated, and the video store had a lot of the best of compilations and things like that. You got to check it out. And you guys writing these books and keeping this alive, it means a lot to us. And we love having you on telling these stories.
Absolutely.
That we had some friends poke their head in the chat. Phil was grateful. You guys answered the question about the abdominal stretch. Of course, we were live. Our friends at Monte the Pharaoh and Dan and Benny in the Ring can be heard anywhere podcasts are listened to. So for the playa himself, for the authors of the wonderful, wonderful book on Wilbur Snyder, Richard Vicek, and Stephen Verrier, I'm Dan Sebastian. Have a good night, everyone, and we will see you next time we're in the ring.